Hello everybody, hope you're doing marvellously well. In this episode we're going to talk about the top 5 mixing mistakes that no one talks about. So please go to producelikeapro.com and you can sign up for a whole bunch of free goodies. There's links all underneath here. So I was thinking this week about things that aren't talked about enough when it comes to mixing. Things that I feel are either ignored or only talked about ever so slightly. So these are the 5 things that I really feel are massively important that we should be talking about when it comes to mixing. Number 1, and this one is huge for me. EQ with your ears, not with your eyes. I know there's some things that you learn and I completely understand and that you will do and repeat. And that's okay. There's things like high passing where we immediately know or instinctively where we want to high pass a signal. And to be honest, some of that is understandable, especially if you're going to manipulate the low end and maybe boost it and they want to control it in a certain area and then come along and high pass it. However, that's not something we should always do without listening in context. If you're going to EQ something, dramatically or not, try to remember listening to it in solo, as much as I understand there is a tendency to listen to solo, is not going to help you in the mix. So you really want to be thinking about how the instrument you're working with, or the vocal you're working with, fits inside of the whole song. So don't just do things by looking and going, oh, I need to roll off at 100. Listen, what's going on? Are you taking off 100? Are you losing some of the fundamental of the signal? Make sure you use your ears. But to me, it's even bigger than that. I've talked about this a bunch of different times, but this is a big thing for me. One of the issues of having plugins that have frequency analyzers in them is the tendency to think just because a signal is peaking like this, that needs to be EQ'd down. No! You have to use your ears first. If you're hearing something and you're hearing a spike that you don't like, that's painful or not musical or is crossing over into another instrument's path, then great, go to your spectrum analyzer that's built into your EQ and see if you can identify by listening. Some of them have a solo and you can find that frequency that is bothering you, that, oh, what is that? Oh, flip around. Great, but don't do it just using your eyes. I see so many people who take this EQ with the frequency analyzer in it with all these boosts and start just dipping them. So it's like looking at a city scene. There's all these peaks and troughs, peaks and troughs, peaks and troughs, like skyscrapers and small buildings and stuff. And it is absolutely crazy. Just because something looks like it's peaking on the spectrum analyzer in your plugin doesn't mean it's something you want to take out. Let's be honest, a lot of instruments, their fundamental might be really, really aggressive in a mid-range frequency, but that might be why that instrument works. It might be why the person who tracked it recorded it. If they're doing like a wah tilted guitar, wah, mid-range kind of 1.5K rip your head off, you don't want to remove that. Maybe you want to soften it, maybe you don't, but it's quite likely they did that because that cuts through in the mix and has a purpose. A lot of singers have really powerful mid-ranges. Maybe you want to tuck a little bit of it down, but to go and look at it and go, oh, there's this big mid-range, I need to soften it. And suddenly this voice becomes soft and Please, 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 you need to trust your ears. Don't use the spectrum analyzer to make decisions on what something sounds like. The only way to know what something sounds like is to listen to it. Use your ears, not your eyes. It's a big one, and I get a lot of stuff to mix that's had these peaks removed so that everything on the mix sounds flat and boring and dull, and nothing is aggressive and nothing is jumping out. Everything starts to sound super, super safe. Remember, so many instruments, so many vocals, so many things that we love about music are fundamentally wrong. They're like screaming mid-range or, aggressive snare. Let's just say you've got this amazing snare ring that's like gong, and on your spectrum analyzers it's doing this. Do you pull it out because it looks like it's peaking? Yeah, if you don't want a ringing snare, but if you did want a ringing snare that's like aggressive and fitting in this heavy track. Why would you do that? Use your ears. Anyway, I'm hammering home the point, but you get it. Use your ears, not your eyes when you're EQing. Don't compress everything. This is quite a silly one because it seems really obvious, but you'd be surprised. I get a lot of mixes where compression is just applied for the sake of applying compression. There's certain things that are so obvious they don't need compression. Huge, massive, heavy guitars, which are just a brick of just distortion and massiveness. Putting compression on them most often makes them sound smaller. So the last thing you need to do when you've got this massively heavily distorted guitar sound is compress it. You might want to dip some EQ, you might want to boost some EQ, who knows? But the last thing you need to do is compress it first. Let it breathe, let that sound be great. Secondly, virtual instruments. Some of them are recorded so evenly and so well, they're not like organic instruments. We talked about this last week. Organic instruments like kick drums. Velocity on samples can be literally that, just loud and quiet. So it's the same kick drum sample, for instance, turned down. That is not the same as playing it softly. When you play a kick drum softly, you might get some of the low end out of it as the resonance of the kick drum happens. But when you hit it harder, the low end might still be there to a certain extent, but the attack increases. So that's why on an organic instrument, you might want to compress it more because you might want to bring up the attack and the low end and make them meet a little bit together so it's more even. Now, on a lot of program stuff that I get, that is not an issue. It's literally like program stuff is quite often just a kick drum that's laid in that may be up and down in volume. The velocity changing isn't actually as big a deal as the relationship between the attack and the drive, the boom of the kick. So that's why I would use a compressor more readily on a live kick, and on a programmed kick, I don't use it as often. Or if I do use it, I use significantly less on the programmed kick than I would on the live kick. Next thing, synths. Big, fat, virtual synths that are just like a block of square wave of sawtooth synthesizer. Last thing you need to do is put compression on it. The compression thing is probably just another way to make it sound smaller. In those instances, if things want to be louder or quieter, just use volume automation. And the reality is like I'm compressing very organic, very dynamic signals that I'm trying to control. I'm not compressing undynamic signals. So just literally opening up a compressor and putting it on everything is a waste of your time and energy. Be very selective about what you compress. Vocals, love compression, especially if they weren't recorded with any and somebody is incredibly dynamic. But even then, you might want to use minor amounts of serial compression and then automate volume control, all of the peaks and troughs inside of the vocal. Automation can do a lot more than compression when used wisely. Don't use the compressor as a lazy way of controlling the dynamics and ruining how the song might breathe. Get in there and use it strategically and use it to enhance, not to destroy. 3, not everything has to be in stereo. I love stereo. It's great. I love 5.1. I love Atmos. I love surround, all of it. It's all fantastic. But this idea when we're working in stereo that everything is like LCR is great. I actually like LCR when you're talking about rock and big, powerful guitars and stuff. That's not really my issue about taking one guitar and putting it in one speaker, taking its double and putting it in another. That is not the issue. The issue is when you get signals that are stereo, like overheads, a piano mic. They don't have to be wah, wah, hard right or left panning. Well, for you, it would be hard right and left panning. Be judicious about how you do that. If you start panning everything super left and right, reverbs, all the ambience, overheads, pianos, strings. If everything starts to be like this, nothing sounds like this. It all just turns into a bunch of clutter. Get strategic about how you're going to do it. Yes, mono heavy guitar on one side, mono heavy guitar on the other side, a double of it. Not the same performance, but a brand new performance. We'll make them sit specifically in the speakers. Overheads though, I like 70 or 80% a lot these days. Just bring them in a little bit. Get that drum kit to sit here rather than like kick, snare, tom-tom, overheads like this. Rooms, same thing. Pan them in a little bit. Make it start to feel like it's sitting in this middle here with some width. But then when you want to go hard left, hard right on those guitars, or hard left, hard right, when you want to get those guitars super wide, they will feel wide. They'll feel like they're in that space. Panning those overheads in a little bit. Grand pianos. It's great if it's a single vocal and a piano to have it be massive and expansive. But when it comes to a dense track and you've got a grand piano in there, why would you want it to be super left and right? You start doing that, again, you're covering anything that you're trying to get wide out there. And so suddenly it all becomes really cluttered. On the subject of pianos, for instance, if I've got an upright, I can definitely stereo mic it. But quite often, in fact, all the time, quite frankly, I use a AEA ribbon mic on a piano and we keep it mono. And that works great. I can take that piano and I can leave it down the center, or I can pan it to one side slightly. If I want a bit of ambience to just make it feel a little bit stereo, maybe I'll do that. But essentially, I like recording it in mono. It gives me a lot more opportunity to create space in my mix. If that piano is then wide and stereo with a wide stereo reverb around it, all of the mix has just turned into a bunch of mush. I've got this stereo piano with stereo reverb, overheads, room mics, guitars, ambience, all going around everything, and suddenly it's just really, really complex. If you listen to the great mixes, and when I mean great mixes, like a Bob Clearmountain mix, or a Mark Endert mix, or a Spike Stead mix, like the true artists out there, you listen to some of their stuff. Chad Blake, I mean, come on, it's absolutely fantastic mixes. When you listen to what they're doing, they're really creating space and depth. You know, yes, there's some LCR going on, but there's a lot cleverer stuff going on. You know, Bob Clearmountain, for instance, has like sounds where he puts an effect and a delay underneath it in its place quite often, and it just feels completely in its place. Mono reverbs, mono delays, putting them underneath the source or opposite is a really, really smart way to go. So take your guitar sound that you're putting in like 50% in the verse, and then if it's got a slap delay or a reverb, put it directly underneath. Sit it underneath, maybe pull down a little bit, and it will firmly place it in that place. If you do want it to feel a little bigger, maybe take that reverb that's at 50% on that side and put it on 50% on the other side. And now you've got a stereo image, but it's like a reverb in mono in one place, it's the original guitar sound in mono in one place, and it starts to create a nice story for your ears. How about that for a quote? Story for your ears. Rather than taking that one guitar and then putting a big stereo reverb around it and just having this wash of everything going all over the place. Not everything has to be stereo. You don't need always stereo ambience on everything. You don't need every piano to be super left and right and wide and just think about this. Think about how much space you can really create if you start getting really selective about where you place things. And also these tricks on having like reverbs underneath mono signals, like mono verbs on a vocal. You want a classic 50s, 60s soul stacks, Motown sound, try a mono reverb, try a mono plate, a mono chamber directly under the vocal. That will make it sound more classic than trying to have a stereo one around it. Start thinking about that. Start thinking not everything has to be stereo. Number 4. Now I have talked about this before, and it's something that a few people touch upon. So I can't say this is one that's completely not spoken about, but I will say is ignored quite greatly. Don't start doing anything. Don't do any processing, any EQs, any compression until you're inside the track, meaning get your panning and levels set first. Open up a song. If you've got a rough mix, God bless it. At least you'll have a guide of where you want to go. But open it up and start panning around and getting the levels to be something like a rough mix that you would be happy with. Take the drum kit, for instance, and pan the hi-hat where it's supposed to go, pan the toms where they're supposed to go. Get those overheads, maybe not too wide. Get the room mics, maybe not too wide. Put your bass down the center, put your lead vocal down the center. Then maybe you've got heavy guitars in the chorus, a pair, hard left and hard right, see how that feels. Then maybe there's some background vocals. Maybe background vocals don't need to be left and right. Maybe they can be just around the vocal. Another great trick, just tuck it around the vocal. Start thinking that way, get that panning right, get the levels right. Frankly, if you get into doing that every time, it might be just a couple of passes and you've got a good rough mix. Only listen to the song a couple of times without applying any compression and EQ. That will do two things. Most importantly, it will teach you the song. You'll be forced to listen to the song and hear all the parts. You won't be starting straight off trying to get the world's greatest drum sound and then put on the world's greatest bass sound and world's greatest guitar sound and keyboard sounds and all this stuff. You will literally hear it as a whole. That's the first thing. And the second thing is you will know what to do by doing that. Simple as that. If you get the panning and the levels right, you'll know where to apply the EQ. You'll know where to compress because you'll be thinking to yourself, well, I got the bass down the middle, I've got these heavy guitars left and right, but when the chorus comes in, it just turns into total mud. So you know, aha, I need to high pass those heavy guitars. There's too much low end in the heavy guitars. So you put an EQ on, take some of that up. You might also go, oh, all the overheads and the ambience on the drums disappeared when the chorus guitars came in. So maybe you have to low pass the guitars or wipe off a little bit. Maybe 7K is the top you want on those heavy guitars. And suddenly, oh, there's some ambience come back in, the overheads. The vocal now has some air on the top of the vocal. Meaning you don't have to apply so much high-end EQ to the overheads, so much high-end EQ to the vocal. See how this works? You start listening to it as a whole and not listening to it in individual parts. Get the panning and the levels right, and it will tell you the decisions that you need to make. It will pinpoint the areas that need to be improved. The best way to mix, the number one way to mix, is to listen to the song as a whole. Listen to the song as a whole. So how do you do that? Get in there, set the levels, get the panning right, and you will learn a lot about the track and what you need to work on. Number 5, do less. If you followed the step in number 4, you'll realize you'll be able to hear the song as a whole and be able to make better decisions. What happens as a result of that? You do less. You do less because you're making smarter choices. You're going back and listening to it as a whole, you've got the panning and the levels right to start off with, and you start to figure out what you need to do to make the whole song better. So do less. Start with the mentality of I don't want to put a plugin on everything unless I have to. You may end up putting 1 or 2 plugins minimum on everything. You may have a few things you don't need to put anything on because it already is recorded, maybe with a virtual instrument, perfectly. Maybe there are parts only in the verse and then parts only in the chorus. So you turn the parts up in the chorus needs to come up and you turn the parts down in the verse that needs to come down. The point is like sometimes things work like that. Many, many great producers and engineers record things the way they want them to be. Therefore, you really just have to level match it and pan them. So that's one way to help you do less. But ultimately, always think like this. Do less. The less you do, the more characteristics of the original signal you'll keep. Now, don't get me wrong. If somebody gives you a DI and says, make me a heavy guitar sound out of this, you can't just use the DI. You've got to find a plugin that will work. You've got to find an impulse response to go on that amp that's going to make it sound real. You might have to add some ambience to make it sound like it's in a room and not completely dry. I get it. And you may have to apply some EQ. All of these things may have to happen, but I get given stuff all the time and every single professional mixer says the same thing, that 90% of the time they open up a session to be mixed and they find themselves turning off plugins. I remember we talked to Howard Willing a couple of years ago. He said he had just mixed a record and the first song he sent to the band, they were like, wow, it sounds so big. What did you do? And he said, I turned off most of your plugins. They spent so much time EQing and sculpting everything to fit together like this crazy jigsaw puzzle that they had taken all of the life out of every instrument. Now, you know I believe in high passing and creating space, but there's bad high passing. And bad high passing is thinking that everything has to be this puzzle, this set of Lego blocks. It doesn't. Things can cross over. Even when I do suggest high passing, I always say use a really gentle slope. If you're trying to get a bass out of the way of a kick, just give it a gentle slope. It doesn't need to be this. It's just pulling out some of the excessive amounts of low end. It's not removing the low end. That's another thing. That's another bit of misinformation about not high passing. Now, high passing is good, but use it gently. So once again, do less. The less you do, the more of the original integrity of the recording will be kept. Now, obviously, with virtual instruments and DIs and stuff like that, the integrity is just whatever they've given you, and you do have to sculpt things quite dramatically if you've only got a DI. If you've got a big fat synth and it's an acoustic guitar, you're going to have to take some of that big fat synth down to sit with the acoustic. I get it. In 99.9% of the situations, most of the sessions that we get to open up have far too much work done to them, and they've tied themselves in knots. So bear that in mind. Try to think and come from the position of doing less. Try doing less, and you will find, if you get that panning and the levels right, you'll make much better decisions, and you'll be able to do less because all the decisions you make will sound so much better. And I'm telling you, when you sit in a room with a really amazing, world-class mixer and see how little they do sometimes, it's pretty remarkable. Now, don't get me wrong. Sometimes they're doing really incredible things, but they're doing really subtle, very smart things using pieces of outboard equipment or plugins in a very subtle way to sculpt that sound really beautifully. It's very rare I open up something from a great mixer and see 5 EQ plugins, 5 compressors, a multiband, and goodness knows what else. Yeah, I see plugins on there, but I can tell you many, many, many times I've opened up stuff with multiple EQs and compressors going on that are doing really drastic things all the time. One's maybe cut too much, so it's added a bit back afterwards and just kept adding and adding and adding and adding. And don't get me wrong, we all do what we have to do to make it great. Of course, and sometimes the chain doesn't make a lot of sense because you have slowly added things. I get it. But if you come from the mentality of doing less, you'll be more focused on what you need to do because you'll be listening more. And once again, you have your panning and level set at the beginning will really, really help you out. Wonderful. And I think as a bonus one, we said 5, but as a bonus number 6, trust your ears. I want to do a whole episode on it. Trust your ears. You really need to trust your ears. So many times people send me something and go, what do you think? And I listen to it, and then I will say to them, well, what do you think? And they'll immediately say to me, oh, I don't like the bass sound. It sounds too boomy. I can't get the low end to glue with the guitars in the choruses. And I'll say, well, what do you think? I'm like, exactly what you think. And they're like, oh, really? I thought you'd... I'm like, no, trust your ears. I just may have 5 different ways of solving a problem, but frankly, no matter who you are, it doesn't matter what famous mixing, mastering engineer you are, we all hear things. We just interpret them, and we have skills and ways of improving them. So trust your ears. You probably already, whatever level you're at, will know when something doesn't sound good. The reality is you don't necessarily have the technical expertise to solve it or the understanding why it's wrong. All of those things I totally relate to. But if you do trust yourself more often, you can move with confidence and make better decisions. So do trust your ears. And if something sounds boomy, it may be your room. So check in other environments. If something isn't quite right, but it sounds different in different systems, then check it in different systems. Use earbuds, use headphones, use the card test. Do all of those things to tell yourself what really is going on, because rooms can really, really affect how we hear things. Thank you ever so much for tuning into this video. Have a marvelous time recording and mixing and mastering and all that great, wonderful stuff. Please leave a bunch of comments and questions below. I'd love to know what other tips you have. These to me are like 5 that keep coming up over and over again and aren't as maybe as exciting to talk about as some of the other ones, but these are really important tips for me. So speak to you all again very soon. Please go to producelikeapro.com, sign up for the email list. Don't forget to subscribe, and of course, please hit the like button.